Okay. Okay, hi. I'm Tammar Appel. I introduced the program earlier, and I'm happy that you've joined me for this session on the Menorah Society. Has anyone heard of the Menorah Society? Yes, okay. So usually in a crowd of around this size, there's maybe one person who's heard of it. It was a very, very interesting and also important institution in the early to mid 20th century, primarily the early 20th century. I'm recording, yeah, thank you. In the early 20th century, but not that well known. And I personally find it fascinating in the way that it really touches on various aspects of American Jewish identity and questions about what it means to be an American Jew in the college setting and as a thoughtful person, and really, I think, resonates for us today in certain ways, but I'm not going to really be I'm not going to be making those connections between the early 20th century and today. I think they'll be fairly obvious and also interesting for all of us to mull over when we're done. So I'll just get started, and you'll find out over the course of the session what the Menorah Society was. We'll be looking at a few letters and kind of primary sources that will help us understand it. And the way I'll do this is, rather than wait until the end and ask if you have any questions, if you have questions as I'm speaking, feel free to ask, and I'll certainly be happy to make this, not exactly lecture, but sort of sharing my knowledge as well as a discussion at the same time. Okay? Okay. So our story, our story begins at Harvard, actually, at the start of the 20th century. The reason that I have, let me ask you, would it be better if I turned off the lights, or?
Probably is better. Yeah, it is a little better.
I can turn off the lights completely.
Yeah, much better.
Better?
Much
okay.
better.
Some people might want to take notes, but if at some point you want the lights on, I can turn them back on. Okay, but I will have slides come up a few times. So it begins at Harvard at the start of the 20th century, and the reason I have Emerson Hall, which actually was built in 1905, 1906, it was built in preparation for that school year at Harvard, is that the Menorah Society has everything to do with philosophy and philosophical exploration. So it begins in Harvard, but it actually quickly spreads the story of the Menorah Society to many other college campuses. So before we look at exactly what it was, I want to give you the background of what it meant to be a Jew on a college campus, just demographically, okay, in the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. So in the 1870s, fewer than 10 students attended Harvard. I mean over the course of a decade. Fewer than 10 students attended Harvard. However, by the eve of World War I, so we're talking about 44 years later, Jews comprised about 10% of the Harvard population, so a fairly steep rise. In 1916, Jews comprised 29% of students at Hunter College, that's middle of World War I, 29% of students at Hunter, 21% at NYU, 18.5% at Temple University. Now beyond that, we also have Jews very much involved in the various extracurricular and co-curricular aspects of life on campus. So in 1922, we go back to Harvard because that is where the story is going to begin. Jews comprised 19% of students in musical clubs and 38.5% in debating clubs at Harvard. Now, according to a small group of Jewish students at Harvard, this blessing of equal footing and intermingling on college campuses really was accompanied by a curse. And they identified this as a curse of ignorance. This group noted that in the early 20th century, most Jewish students at Harvard had little, if any, knowledge of their own Jewish heritage. They were very immersed in college life at every level, not just in philosophy, obviously, in every level, but had very, very little knowledge of their own Jewish heritage. Certainly there were no Jewish studies courses, what's really commonplace now, right? At any major university in the United States and Canada has Jewish studies courses. It would be many decades before that would begin to happen on secular college campuses, and almost a full century before it would become commonplace. But as we all know, it doesn't take Jewish studies courses on a college level to educate a Jew. And yet these college students at Harvard noted that there's what they called an epidemic of Jewish apathy on college campuses. Apathy, assimilation, and also a lack of cultural pride, which was very important to these young men. I do mean young men.
Just a question, were these second generation, do you think?
It's a good question, great. I'm going to come to that a little bit more later, but let me just address that. So we're talking exclusively Jews of German extraction. which means that when we talk about second-generation Jews in American history, usually, not always, usually, that we actually refer to the East European immigration to America that took place between the 1880s and 1920s. So the second generation were the children born of those immigrants. Here we're talking about Jews who were from families who had arrived over the course of the 19th century, German Jews. So they were at least, if we think about it in those terms, they were at least second generation, possibly third by that point. It's a good question. So they were very concerned about this: apathy, lack of cultural pride, assimilation, on a scale that they perceived as threatening to Jewish continuity. Let me just mention the word assimilation for a minute. Assimilation means different things to different people. I need to define it right now. We'll get to this more later also, but these Jews, these people, these young men, and they really were for many years just young men, who were involved with this, we're not talking about people primarily from Orthodox communities or from we're talking about people who had certainly a lot of the education themselves, were interested in Judaism, Jewish history, Jewish culture, Jewish practice even, but weren't necessarily what you and I might use colloquially, the term we might use colloquially is frum. Not most of them, there was a range, but I wouldn't say that most of them were. So when I mean assimilation, I mean things like intermarriage, right? Literally leaving the fold, or such an immersion in the surrounding culture that any connection with your own cultural identity, religious identity is lost. I'll make sure that that's clear. So at a meeting of about 20 Harvard students in 1906, the Harvard Menorah Society was founded. Excuse me. And I'm going to just quote for you their own words at the inaugural meeting. It was founded to combat the widespread ignorance among Jews and non-Jews alike of what is essentially involved in the so-called Jewish question. The question, namely, of the place of the Jews and Judaism in the modern world. I want to mention briefly two of the founders. There was a cohort of about probably 10 to a dozen men at this initial meeting. Two of the founders were important people in American Jewish life, or would become important people in American Jewish life. The person on the right, Henry Hurwitz, might not be such a familiar name. He, even though he was very important, became an attorney, very important sort of on a small scale. He's, other than his association with and founding of Menorah, he didn't have, his reach, did not extend beyond that. So he's not as well known a name. Has anyone heard of Horace Kalin, or know who he is? So Horace Kalin actually is a very important person in American Jewish history. Horace Kalin was a philosopher. And he wrote books and articles that really did have a far reach in American life and American Jewish life. And in fact, he was in college at this point, but what he was to do later, what he would do later, is in engaging in questions of philosophy and identity and what it means to be an American, and what we often call the hyphenated identity of American Jews. He actually came up with an alternative to Israel Zangwill's melting pot to describe what it means to have a combination of cultures. He came up and really promoted the idea of the orchestra, that in which every culture, people from every culture and ethnic identity and racial and religious identity retain their own beautiful music, right, while contributing to the whole and also gaining, becoming that much more beautiful for being part of a large group. Excuse me. So these two people were among the founders of the Menorah Society. What began as the Menorah Society, which with that express goal, eventually grew to become the Intercollegiate Menorah Association. Let me see if I can get rid of this. Hold on. Became the Intercollegiate Menorah Association, which means that it spread, here we go, it spread well beyond, I apologize for those lines, well beyond Harvard. So just to give you a sense again of the spread, this was in 1905, 1906 that the Menorah Society started. By 1913, there were 20 societies throughout the Northeast and Midwest of the United States, including University of Chicago, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Wisconsin, Ohio State University, Boston University, and then by 1917, just 4 years later, there were 70 societies, not only in the United States but also in Canada. And Canada was very robust. In fact, when I was doing some research, I first started looking into the Menorah Society actually about 25 years ago when I myself was in college, as part of research I was doing. And I revisited it a few times since. So most recently, when I looked to see what's currently out there about the Menorah Society, not only has a book been published, which was very gratifying to me in the past few years, But if you look on the web, if you enter Menorah Society and you look for pictures of it from the early 20th century, most of the pictures of groups of people from Menorah Society are actually from the University of Toronto, and from across multiple years. So it became very robust there, which is an interesting piece. I don't particularly have expertise in Canadian Jewish history, but insofar as immigration occurred to both Canada and the United States, and you know, the sort of similarities in culture, it's interesting that it became so very popular and important there.
Question.
Yes.
Many of the Menorah societies involved with the city colleges in New York.
Yeah, in fact, it's funny, I didn't list that there. Yes. Excuse me, soon, in about halfway into my presentation here, we're going to be starting to talk about a journal that they produced, that the Menorah produced, and it was actually centered in New York. It began in Midtown, and then it migrated southward to Greenwich Village and became sort of an important piece of the Greenwich Village, like, you know, Jewish liberal intelligentsia. Hunter College, it was a very big deal at Hunter College, absolutely. So Menorah Society was very significant in multiple colleges in New York, yes. I listed these particularly because they're kind of not as much on our radar, but in New York it was very important. Okay. I want to show you one more piece here. This was, here we go. and I was about to talk about it, I didn't even remember. Okay, so the Hunter College Menorah Society here, I just wanted to show you this one, piece of a pamphlet of the Hunter College Menorah Society, and lists the officers. This is 1917, 1918. And the one piece that I want to read here in the middle is where it says that this is a movement among students in American colleges and universities to promote knowledge of Jewish history and culture and modern life, and that which was originated at Harvard in October 1906, when the Harvard Menorah Society was formed. So this continued to be its goal, right? Its reason for being.
They're all women.
I'm sorry?
They're all women.
Right. Oh, good. Thank you for mentioning that. So in the beginning, as I said, in the beginning, it was only going to be men. And if you look at the Harvard Menorah Society founders from the beginning, the first 10 to 12 years, you see one man after the next. And then, when we get toward the end of World War I or so, we start to see more and more women in the pictures, and of course here on the list of who's involved, the president and so on. So yes, it became more embracing of women, and as the Jewish population on campuses increased, that it wasn't only men at this point that were increasing in number, it was women who were attending colleges in greater number, and not only men. So that kind of goes along with the demographics in general. The whole history of Jews on college campuses, men and women, is in a really fascinating, presentation unto itself. Not what I'm doing right now, but it's very interesting. So, I apologize, I have a cold, and try to keep that at bay as much as I can. So Menorah was committed to a rebirth of the Jewish spirit, really at a time when religious interest among Jews coming of age on college campuses was waning. It saw both the United States and the liberal university setting, where ideas flowed freely and generously. It saw that really as the ideal setting for fostering this awakening. In addition, it embraced this ideal of noblesse oblige, right? That Jews should view themselves as contributing of their culture to the scope of what it means to be American. Not just to become more knowledgeable Jewishly, but then to share that and to make American culture become influenced in positive ways by Jewish culture. Menorah professed at this point three major purposes. One, that it was an academic organization, in other words, by the second decade of its existence. One, that it was an academic organization promoting what it called the Jewish humanities. Two, a moral body for sustaining Jewish ideals, but those ideals were always vaguely conceived, right? Morality is a broad term, but it certainly it cared about that as an organization. And three, yes, that it would be an organ of American patriotism as well. And if you're familiar with Louis Brandeis's work at all, not just his stature as Supreme Court Justice, but also his work on American Zionism, he would say very, very clearly, just about a decade and a half later, that in fact, for a Jew to be a good American, a Jew should be a Zionist. And so for him, he actually became involved in the Menorah Journal, which we'll get to soon. So this idea that American patriotism can be an outgrowth of revisiting and reawakening Jewish spirit was not unfamiliar they wanted to promote it much further than it already existed at the time. Excuse me. Now, the Intercollegiate Menorah Association, far from just a bunch of meetings one after the next, you could say, well, how did they want to accomplish these goals? This is actually just a partial list of the various activities that they engaged in. National and regional conventions, Menorah College of Lecturers, in which they invited people to come in and speak at each campus's Menorah meetings, as well as sometimes campuses sharing a lecturer jointly. Menorah libraries, in which they really accumulated books that would be of interest to promote the ideas that they were talking about. They were interested in Menorah summer schools, 6-week summer schools to study intensive Jewish ideas, history, culture, Menorah School of Adult Education, nighttime schools, and Menorah Refugee Aid, which was very much tied in with what I mentioned earlier about its sense of noblesse oblige, giving back to the community, or giving of themselves. But in this case, refugee aid meant primarily, can you imagine what that meant if we're talking about 18, 20, 25, 30, these German Jews wanting to support refugees? What do you think? Who do you think those refugees were? So we're talking primarily about East European Jews, right? And sometimes from Germany, but mostly what we're talking about is the refugee aid to support East European Jews who were increasingly trying to flee Eastern Europe. Now, an important piece of this is sort of a little bit of an aside, but I think in order to understand what was happening in the culture at large, or in the country at large, is I mentioned that East European immigration to America is generally considered 1880s, the huge wave, 1880s to 1920s. The year when if you look at charts of immigration to the United States, what you see is that throughout the 1880s, through the 1910s, teens, it just increases by a huge number. We go from 1,000 to 10,000 to tens of thousands to 100,000 or 200,000 in a year. And then in 1924, there's a severe cutoff, because that's when the quotas on immigration were imposed very, very strictly. So there was this sense that in the United States that really might happen at any moment, even before 1924. And so there was this kind of a rush to try to integrate and get East European immigrants integrated. So we'll talk about that a little bit more soon, but that's really what we're talking about here, is the German Jews really being conscious of new Jews and different kinds of Jews coming and needing to be integrated. Excuse me. I want to show you something. The memorandum on Menorah Refugee Aid, in the middle of it, it has this line about the refugee aid. It bucks them up. It makes them, the East Europeans, feel useful again, down to spare, renewed careers in a new land. This is a very, very famous postcard among many that were produced in this time, Shana Tova postcards that from the early 20th century. It says here on the bottom of Shana Tova, Happy New Year, and I don't think it's very legible on this screen, but it says here on Kanfei Hashavim, I think they're brought on the wings of eagles. And so here you have the German Jews, the Central European, not all German, Hungarian, other Central European Jews who had come across the 19th century into the early 20th century, but primarily 19th century, who were already fully acculturated, who were dressed like Americans, who were sophisticated, or at least well-off and well-dressed Americans, and welcoming with open arms, literally with open arms, the East European immigrants carrying their bags and looking very religious. What's in this picture is you can read it on the surface and see what we see, which is this welcoming and attempt to aid, to help and support. But there was always a sort of a hostility underlying this. There was always a sense of condescension, right? That part of why we want to help them integrate is that we're a little bit embarrassed about them. They're poor. They're not worldly, and they are not necessarily so clean according to the standards of cleanliness in the United States. And they're going to present. There's going to be some fear of the economic competition that they're going to present. New York and other areas, but certainly New York is going to become run over with them. And so German Jews, what we called uptown Jews, as opposed to what historians called, and literally geographically were uptown Jews, were very much wanted to help the downtown Jews, the East European Jews, but also had a certain sense of they are us, but they're not exactly us, so we have to make sure they become a little bit more like us, that kind of dynamic. And so Menorah was involved on that level. Excuse me. The Menorah, let me come back to who these Menorah founders were and a little bit about this nonpartisanship that I mentioned before. So the Menorah founders at Harvard were virtually all liberal Jews. They were interested not in increasing Jewish observance, but rather in promoting Jewish cultural education and so on. And so what we have here is really an attempt to negotiate American culture. I just want to take a step back and look at that. An attempt to negotiate American culture and Jewish particularity, both at the same time. Right? I'm an American, but in very particular terms, and terms of pride, I am a Jew. And it's really about the search for a meaningful Jewish identity grounded in the world of the intellect. Because even though they were involved in refugee aid, when push came to shove, if you had to isolate what Menorah really was about, it was about the world of the university. This is what they gave, this was their contribution, but their priorities had to do with the world of academia. All Menorah societies were fiercely non-sectarian. They were dedicated to religious nonpartisanship. And they would not even undertake to institute Jewish religious services at a university when some students suggested it. There were times when students suggested, well, once you're doing this, let's also hold some religious services. In all cases, they rejected that because it would not prescribe any particular religious attitude toward its constituents. And with religious nonpartisanship really as a flagstaff of the Menorah banner, Menorah invited leaders of various Jewish denominations to come and speak. So sometimes that meant leaders from RIETS, the Yeshiva universities, Smicha institution, or from Yeshiva University in general, as well as from the Jewish Theological Seminary, as well as from Hebrew Union College. Excuse me. And in some cases, they even invited people like that to join Menorah as what they called graduate members. So you weren't part of us necessarily when you were in college, but come join us. But really to making sure that they were cross-denominational. Okay. Beginning in 1917, added to the Menorah societies, they started producing a Menorah journal. The Menorah journal was a very important organ for Jewish readership in the United States. And it continued through the early 1950s, although really by the middle of the 1940s it was not nearly in as large circulation as it had been. And it was a forum for articles and literature and artistic creations by Menorah members and, by the way, by American Jewish leaders. So they weren't just Menorah Society members writing, they would invite authors and important thinkers and leaders from all over to contribute. Really, the Menorah Journal represented an attempt to transcend the campus setting and move into the Jewish community at large. It enjoyed a widespread reputation, very positive reputation the Menorah Journal had as a literary event. That's what it's called in the press, as a literary event that was, quote, I'm going to quote here, incomparable in intellectual fiber or literary distinction. Very, very well known. There are now huge collations of it that you can buy, actually. It had a wide variety of Jewish and non-Jewish writers, legal minds, philosophers, including, as I mentioned earlier, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, Felix Frankfurter, as well as John Dewey, people from all different kinds of educational and philosophical backgrounds. I'm going to just read some of the names here from volume 1. The first volume was 1916. I mentioned 1917 before, but I had something else in mind. The first volume was in 1916. So some of the authors included Cyrus Adler, who was a very, very important Jewish philanthropist and in the early 20th century, Calvin Kohler, who was a leader in the Reform movement. We have here Mordecai Kaplan, who would later found the Reconstructionist movement. Max Nordau, who was an important Zionist. Richard Gottheil, who's also a very important American Jewish leader. And that's just a few people on the list here. I'm also going to read to you some of the names, some of the titles of the articles in case you can't read them. So one is about Solomon Schechter, who, as you may know, is not only an important leader in conservative Judaism, but he was the He was the founder, most important person correlated with the Cairo Geniza, opening up of the Cairo Geniza, so that we can now have access to all this information about medieval Jewish history. So, Schechter, scholar and humanist, the faith of reform, Judaism, the caravan, a new Hebrew melody, so we have music here, At the Crossroads, I'm not exactly sure what that's about, Prince Ulrich's Minstrel, a story, How May Judaism Be Saved, that's Kaplan, Shalom Ash, whom Professor Dauber mentioned earlier, as a dramatist, An Opportunity for American Students by Max Nordau. I'm going to come back to that in a second. And then some information about the Fourth Menorah Convention. Let me take as an aside mention Max Nordau and Zionism. In addition to being nonpartisan, the Menorah Society was, I'm not going to say anti-Zionist, I'm going to say it was neutral on Zionism. So it was happy to have Max Nordau write an article, but it would not promote Zionism per se. Later, that would become a problem for the Menorah Journal. As American Jews became more conscious of the importance of Zionism to their identity, that would become a problem. But in this time period, it was not problematic for them. Excuse me. Okay. What I'd like to do now for the rest of our time together is to focus on two individuals who wrote for the Menorah Journal. And through them, we're going to learn a little bit about the journal itself and also the significance of the journal in American Jewish life. And when I'm done doing that, we'll talk about the ending of Menorah Society, when and for what reasons it came to an end. First person that I want to speak about is Lionel Trilling. Okay, very important person. I'm sure many of you know this. Very important person in American literary life. He lived from 1905 to 1975. He was a literary critic and teacher. He was the first Jewish academic widely acknowledged for his expertise in the field of literature in the United States. And he spent most of his academic career on the faculty at Columbia. So here's where we get to New York in terms of the publication. And he was among the liberal, what people call the liberal Jewish intelligentsia of Greenwich Village, of Lower Manhattan in the late 1920s. And in fact, in the late 1920s, the Menorah Journal offices moved from Midtown Manhattan to the Village, which was, it's a very lively, literary, philosophically oriented neighborhood. Ultimately, his later works, interestingly, really helped cultivate the neoconservative ideology among intellectuals in the U.S. But that was sort of another separate topic in terms of American Jewish history in the 20th century, how American Jewish liberalism, in some instances, really morphed into neoconservatism. Trilling was among those. That will be important for the Menorah Journal as well. I want to read to you an excerpts of a letter that he wrote in 1929. In 1929, there was a chance that the Menorah Journal was going to fold because of lack of funds. And Trilling wrote a letter to Elliot Cohen, who was one of the leaders in the Intercollegiate Menorah Association, bless you, begging him to keep it alive. And I'm going to read some of it to you, and others I'm going to actually post up here because I think it's worth seeing the words. So listen to what he has to say. I first saw the journal when I was a senior at college about 4 years ago, so he was writing this as a young man. My family is Orthodox, with a pretty sound tradition of learning and piety behind it. But like most families with such a tradition, and with sincere and not unintelligent intentions of continuing it, it was losing out. So, except sentimentally, my parents' gestures could not touch me at all. I need not go through for you the rationalizations of a young man who was bored and unattracted by the whole business. And then we have this. When I first saw the journal, I was first struck by its handsomeness. I had never seen a modern Jewish publication that was not shoddy and disgusting. I suppose my naive apprehension of this acted as a sort of catalyst to whatever vestigial Jewish feeling I had had. I saw that this Jewish manifestation was careful, considered, intelligent. I saw Judaism taken as an accepted and legitimate thing. No apology was being made. Excuse me. And then he continues. I myself, no, here we go. It seems to me that there is but one thing which must be done for Judaism today. content and meaning must be given it in a form as fine, as dignified, as effective as possible. I think that the only thing in Jewish life that could have done that for me was the Menorah journal. If the journal is chucked, then Judaism has also to be chucked and made over into a benevolent association. He actually has this other line afterwards where he says that if it doesn't do that, if it's and if it does do that, if Judaism becomes bereft of this intellectual aspect and just has a benevolent association, then you could just equally choose to join Judaism or the Elks, he says. So it's obviously he feels very strongly about this. So what do you get out of this? Like, what do you think he's really trying to say here? I mean, on the surface, we know he's trying to say, what is he saying about his own Jewish identity wrapped up with the Menorah journal, what he's been able to access to a Menorah journal, and about Judaism in general? Thoughts?
I would say dignity, for one thing.
Right, so certainly this notion of dignity, and every time and whenever I've shown this to people, I always hear a little bit of a gasp when I read this part that he'd never seen a modern Jewish publication that wasn't shoddy and disgusting, right? That he's looking instead for dignity, a dignified Judaism. Anything else that you want to,
Well, religion is intellectualism, it's not cultural and it's not
Right.
Religious.
Right, exactly. And I think there's a little bit of an irony here at the end, because what he's saying is if we don't have that, then Judaism can just be, kind of what I think what he means by a benevolent association is, charitable, we do good things, we're good people, we're nice people. Sort of without the intellectual piece of it, it's meaningless to him, right? But he himself, and Trilling himself and his cohort, were interested exclusively in the intellectual piece, meaning they were not interested in the religious life and the ritual that might have even included these impulses toward, benevolence. Let me be clear, I'm not saying he wasn't benevolent. I'm saying that he was really looking exclusively for the intellectual piece. We're not talking about a rich Jewish life of practice. It was not within his area of interest, and in fact, it's what turned him off in the first place. So for someone like him, this made Judaism accessible. It made it alive. It gave him something he was not able to identify with before. Yes?
Well, he does have this one line about seeing Judaism as a legitimate thing.
Yes.
Which implies that the way he was brought up, Judaism was almost an apology.
Yes.
Right? So we're here in America, but this is what we do because we're from Europe.
Right, and I'm glad you're mentioning that. It's also a very, very important point, because even though these German Jews, and we did talk about the importance of these Jews, Trilling, his cohort, the founders of Menorah, were of German extraction, Central European extraction, and they really were fully integrated into American society. I mean, Lionel Trilling, you don't have to mention him in a Jewish audience to have recognition. I mean, he's a very important person in American history in general, American literary history. Even though they were fully integrated, fully accepted, fully comfortable, there was this sense for, and not just for Lionel Trilling, for others as well, that Judaism, for what it meant for them, just it didn't match the rest of their lives. It somehow felt like something other. And whatever that was, anything I would say would be anything that I would say about what that was would be a gross generalization. For Lionel Trilling it was one thing, for Henry Hurwitz is another, for Horace Kalin it was another thing. But it was some sense that Judaism in its old form, let me put it this way, in its form that was devoted exclusively to religious practice, right? And I'm going to again use a term very colloquial, frumkeit, right, was sort of somehow not allowing people of this ilk to feel connected. And by the way, when I say this ilk, I don't just mean Harvard or Columbia. I mean what they thought was that this was important for anyone in the college setting. Why? Because the college setting, exclusive of Yeshiva University or Jewish Theological Seminary at that time, Gratz College, a few other places, but college setting, for the most part, meant a place where you necessarily were going to intermingle, get a lot out of your social interactions. As we saw in the beginning of this, you would be involved in the debate club, in the music club. You would be involved in so many things that there's this world out there, and it's dignified and it's legitimate, and it fits beautifully with all of your ideas and your ideals. And then there's Judaism. So this allowed them. That's my note. I have 10 more minutes. This allowed them to really feel alive and invested and legitimate. Absolutely. Okay. Yes. I'm sorry.
Pride.
And pride, exactly. A sense of pride. And again, these things are a little bit complicated because it was that same pride that allowed them to both welcome but also feel a little bit of a sense of distance from their Jewish brothers whom they were helping through Menorah refugee aid. The next person that I want to talk about is actually Mordechai Kaplan. So Mordechai Kaplan, most known for being the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, lived from 1881 to 1983, and he wrote for the Journal. He was not a Menorah member per se, but he wrote for the Journal. Kaplan was a Lithuanian immigrant to the United States, so here we are talking about a person of East European descent, but obviously in the category of his own. He was a conservative rabbi ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary at the turn of the 20th century. That was at a point where the lines dividing the conservative and Orthodox movements conservative and Orthodox Judaism were much more porous than they are today. Such that he actually served as the associate rabbi of KJ, the Upper East Side, and later as rabbi of the Jewish Center, Upper West Side, taught at JTS, helped found the Young Israel movement, who later disowned him, not surprisingly, as a heretic. He was most widely known, obviously, for providing the theological, philosophical framework for Reconstructionist Judaism. And he wrote a very famous article in the Menorah Journal
Nina Miller, Donnie
in
Wynn,
August of 1920 that he titled A Program for the Reconstruction of Judaism. So he,
Lior Fetter, Clyde Robinson, Shauna Gershbaum, Shada Dewis, Daphne Levine, Abigail Shapiro, please remember to pick up their Talia rope before they leave. Thank you.
So, excuse me, he, in 1920, he published an article in the Journal, in the Menorah Journal, titled A Program for the Reconstruction of Judaism. This wasn't the official beginning of Reconstructionist Judaism, but it was one of the earliest times, it was probably the earliest time, actually, that he used that word as, conceptually for what he thought needed to be done to Judaism. I'm not going to go into Reconstructionist Judaism right now, another presentation, but Kaplan's affiliation with Menorah was actually an instance of Menorah's lapsing into religious partisanship, which it usually shunned. And I'm actually not going to show you an excerpt of his letter. I bring him up, because he did choose the Menorah Journal as an organ for publishing his first major article about reconstructing Judaism, but also because I think this is an important exception, but not isolated exception, in which it allowed someone of some kind of religious orientation to occupy center stage. You saw earlier that reform leaders wrote, but this was the first case, this was one of the isolated cases in which someone who was completely and solely affiliated with a branch of Judaism and almost was synonymous with it was allowed to contribute. There were only a few such instances in which Menorah allowed this kind of thing to happen. For example, it accepted funds from the Reform Movement's Union of American Hebrew Congregations to support a lecture series, even though on principle it would usually reject even that. It would even reject money, in order not to appear partisan. And in fact, it actually took some heat for doing this. But based on these instances, this kind of situation, Kaplan, the UAHC, we can confirm that even though Menorah prided itself on being an intellectual organization that did not engage directly in matters of religious observance, its founders and leaders were clear sympathizers with liberal Judaism. There was no question about that. And they were most likely to support those movements. The movements with which they sympathized were the ones most likely to support the rationalistic, humanistic approaches to religion and human experiences that Menorah implicitly espoused. Okay, I'm going to spend the last probably 5 minutes, I think I'll end right on the dot, discussing a little bit about the decline of Menorah, because in its heyday, it was really a very important organization, and the journal as well. By the late 1920s, many Menorah societies had collapsed, and the intercollegiate phase of Menorah was coming to an end. There were a few societies left, but that intercollegiate umbrella organization was fraying. So part of this was due to a lack of funding. There was just not enough money after World War I. There was just not enough money to support the programming. Money was the overwhelming factor. But others were cited as well. Other reasons were cited as well by the internal Menorah administration at the time. So, for example, they said, and if you look at the letters that were written, I've gone into the archives and seen them, that they bemoaned actually the decline of students' intellectual levels in college campuses as more middle-class people were sending children to college. They cited especially the East European immigrants, quote, the almost inevitable desire for a college education among the second generation. Now we're coming to the second generation of East European Jews here, right? So this, again, bespeaks a certain elitism, right? The Menorah society can't be as rich and robust and what it is if people just aren't as smart or aren't as intellectual as they were. The more people you have, it dilutes out the, that extra special sort of cream of the crop intellectual bent. And so when more East Europeans come, just that with the demographic, the intellectual level was going to be less. So internally, that's what they said. Looking at it from the outside, we see that funds began to be depleted. Also, excuse me, by the way, in addition to the sheer number of East Europeans on college campuses, just the sheer number of Jews, the number of Jews increasing in college campuses paralleled the increasing population of Jews. So just one other little, statistic here, not statistic, but number. In 1906, when Menorah was founded, the Jewish population in the United States was about 1.5 million, 1.4 million. By 1937, so close to the eve of World War II, it was 4.7 million. So just we're talking about larger numbers of people. And the needs of the Jews were different. In other words, it's a little bit harder to say that so much money should go to an organization such as this when you have refugees from the early 20th century, and then when you have obviously even greater needs as they become integrated into American society. Two other important things that led to the decline of Menorah societies. One was the growing importance of Zionism. As Zionism became more important and fully embraced by American Jews, the Menorah continued not to espouse it as its general approach to nonpartisanship, and probably there was a political piece to that as well. So that became untenable for a number of people on college campuses. We sort of wish that on campuses right now, Zionism would be so fully embraced across the religious spectrum. Here at this time, in the 1930s, 40s, up to 1950, it became a little bit of a indefensible position not to be Zionist as a Jewish organization for a time. And of course, some of you may be thinking this throughout the entire past 45 minutes, Hillel, right? So Hillel, the organization that is very important these days on college campuses. So Hillel began in the 1920s, and it increased in popularity pretty quickly. By the early 1950s, when some Menorah societies, very few were still in existence, Hillel just rendered Menorah obsolete, because Hillel embraced everything. Right? So you could be a Reconstructionist, a Reform Jew, an Orthodox Jew, a conservative Jew. You could be interested in, staffing a soup kitchen. You could be interested in running programming. You could be interested in studying in the Beit Midrash. Hillel was there for you increasingly over the 20th century. So Menorah, with its very narrow vision, just became less relevant. And one last piece about the Menorah Journal, and then I go in. The Menorah Journal also came to an end really along the same lines as the Menorah Society. Part of it was funding. A lot of it was funding. It wasn't there as much. And part of it was Zionism. The Menorah Journal, even though it allowed Max Nordau in that early first edition to publish, it did increasingly seem to have a if not anti-Zionist, then non-Zionist bent. The interesting thing about the Menorah Journal, which could be the beginning of chapter 2 in all this, is that Elliot Cohen, who was one of the important editors of the Menorah Journal, he's the one that Lionel Trilling had written to in that letter. In 1945, Elliot Cohen helped found Commentary Magazine. Inaugural edition, November 1945. And some have viewed Commentary Magazine as the legacy, or I'll just call it chapter 2, of the Menorah Journal. And what I said in the middle of our time here today, that part of what that there's this cohort of what had been liberal political thinkers among the Jews, liberal political and economic thinkers among Jews in that lively literary area, downtown Manhattan, who over the course of time became the founders of neoconservatism, Bill Kristol and Daniel Bell and Lionel Trilling and those people. This was what commentary became over time. And so, the Menorah Journal really becomes, if you look at it with that historical lens, the Menorah Journal becomes the first piece of it, the first chapter, or the first instance of an organ on college campuses, originating in college campuses, to promote this idea of open-mindedness, intellectual inquiry. But the political frame of that would change over time. Menorah to later Menorah to commentary to various permutations later. That particular bent would change with American history and cultural change, and American Jewish history and cultural change. Okay, so that is all. I'm finished. Thank you for joining me. And have a great Shabbat and a good day.
Thank you.